today's speaker, Melanie Mark-Shadbolt, co-founder and trustee of Te Tira Whakamātaki, and Deputy Secretary Tūmatakōkiri, that's Māori Rights and Interests at the Ministry for the Environment. Mel, I'm just passing the screen to you if you can accept the invitation to present there. Mel is going to be talking to us about seed sovereignty, an issue that needs to be considered with some urgency in New Zealand, especially in light of the threat posed by myrtle rust. Now, this disease threatens several native and endemic species, with localised extinction a real possibility for some. Seed conservation needs to be part of our response and undertaken in a way congruent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, New Zealand's founding document. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing more about this today. Mel, I'm just having some trouble seeing, oh no, there's your slides. Good, let's just park everything up there. Take a deep breath. Sounds like I need the breath more than you, Mel. And we're ready to begin your presentation if you're good to go.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Renee. E te whānau, haere mai, nau mai, whakatau mai rā ki tēnei hui hui nei, ki te kaupapa o tēnei rā, nō reira piki mai, kaki mai, whakatau mai rā, anō e mihi ana ki ngā kaimahi, Renee, Marsh, tēnā kōrua, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, me te rohi tēnā koutou. Ko waiau, he uri au o Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Porou, te Arawa, te Ātiawa, Whakatohea, Rangitane, Tūwharetoa rātou, a ko te Ati Gun, me Macintosh hoki, ko Melanie Mark-Shadbolt, tōku ingoa. As Renee said, I'm Mel, wear a number of hats, speaking to you today as a co-founder and trustee of Te Tira Whakamātaki, the Māori Biosecurity Network, an environmental not-for-profit who have a real passion for seed sovereignty or seed conservation. Again, thanks to the Beyond Myrtle Rust program, to Renee, Marge and the team for inviting me to be part of your speakers series, your webinar series, and to speak on the topic today, this topic, and one I'm really passionate about, seed conservation. Before I delve into the kōrero about what seed sovereignty means for us at Te Tira Whakamātaki and what we are doing, I thought it might be useful to briefly touch on indigenous experiences of global conservation and particularly how that relates to seed sovereignty. I suspect much of what I say you will know, and we may have different views on it, but that's kei te pai anyway. So conservation has largely benefited from a positive image, being seen as altruistic with a focus on helping endangered and threatened animals and plants. It's rare for people to associate it with racism or violence, but it is absolutely connected to human rights abuses, colonization, colonialism, and the belief of cultural superiority embedded in white supremacy. So while we are having the long overdue conversation about the perpetuation of racism in and across society, in our justice systems, sports, movies, music industries and governments, and even recently in our monarchies, we must also have the conversation about racism in research and in conservation. Nature conservation has its roots in colonialism and white supremacy. And one of the views that underpins the colonial view of nature is the idea that nature and people are separate. The separation asserts that wilderness and civilization are opposites and that civilization is better and superior to nature. It stems in part from the Christian view of the world, which elevates the importance of humans over nature, but also the widely held view that overpopulation is the root cause of environmental problems, a view that in my mind is rather simplistic and excuses the overconsumption and energy-intensive lifestyles of the wealthy people in advanced economies. This view that humans and nature should be separate has contributed in part to the creation of nature reserves, national parks, ecosystems, eco-sanctuaries and the like. These areas are devoid of people and are a place where rare animal species and plants are protected from predators, including humans, often via barriers such as fences. And this approach to conservation has in part led to the militarisation and fortification of conservation in New Zealand. That's evident in the language we use around conservation. The Indigenous advocacy organisation Cultural Survival states in the past 150 years, more than 12% of the world's surface has been set aside through the establishment of some 100,000 protected areas. By some estimates, around 50% of these protected areas encompass lands and territories traditionally occupied and used by Indigenous people. Survival International estimate up to 14 million people have had their land stolen for conservation, and that land has been managed by people who aren't connected to it and arguably don't trust the locals to look after it. National parks across the globe have been created by removing, sometimes violently, the indigenous peoples who live on those lands, have lived there for thousands of years, and often for the establishment of these protected areas or game hunting areas often. Similarly, many of our large conservation organisations are closely linked to racist and colonial thinking. Some have issued apologies for their role in human rights abuses. Others live in perpetual denial of their role in discriminating against indigenous peoples. If you heard me speak a couple of weeks ago at Ōtātou Ngāhere, you'll know that I spoke to the role that NGOs have in ensuring that they acknowledge their whakapapa, and how in Project Crimson, a trust I'm aligned with, we are doing that, but then that they create systems and processes to move beyond that. Because what we don't want is a repeat of the calling out of the human rights abuses and the violence by national park rangers in countries like Nepal, India, Congo, Cameroon. And those were called out in about 2019, when it was acknowledged that the use of heavily armed rangers whose military training and equipment was co-financed by ENGO WWF were carrying out violent attacks on local people, including cases of murder, torture, sexual violence, evictions, destructions of homes, as you can see in the picture, all under this guise of fighting poaching and creating eco-sanctuaries or eco-safaris. And unfortunately, it wasn't the first case when that was called out of violence in the name of conservation. And WWF, to be fair, aren't the only NGO that has helped fund and cover up human rights abuses. The entire conservation sector is guilty of human rights violence through its very creation. So it's no wonder that groups like Extinction Rebellion argue there can be no conservation without justice and no conservation without the protection of human rights and land rights. What we would add to that is nature's rights. So as the 5th World Parks Congress was held in South Africa in 2003, the Indigenous delegate summed up what is a reoccurring problem for First Nations, Indigenous people across the globe, and that's here, and I'm happy to share that with you. And I think this is a really good, fast explanation of how Indigenous people experience conservation. He said, the declaration of protected areas on Indigenous territories without our consent and engagement has resulted in our dispossession and resettlement, the violation of our rights, the displacement of our peoples, the loss of our sacred sites, and the slow but continuous loss of our culture, as well as impoverishment. It is thus difficult to talk about the benefits for Indigenous people when protected areas are being declared on our territories unilaterally. First, we're dispossessed in the name of kings and emperors, later in the name of the state development, and now in the name of conservation. Again, a really good summary of how Indigenous people experience conservation. So the view that people in areas colonised are inferior in every way to their colonisers, that they're backward in a rational idolisation of nature as a living and sentient being with its own rights, and that they're godless, wild, primitive and dangerous, perhaps not even human, and that they need to be saved and civilised, was actually quite a normal view in not only colonisation but in initial conservation. And that resulted in large confiscation of Indigenous people's lands, and therefore their language and culture. And it hasn't helped us build inclusive conservation approaches. The brutal destruction of Indigenous cultures through colonisation, and this belief that we must subdue the earth and that nature is an object or resource gifted to us by God, reinforces the view that Western approaches to conservation, underpinned by their knowledge systems, their sciences and their keepers, is one of the biggest issues that we have in the conservation space, and it plays out in the seed space, as I will talk about in a minute. And it also downplays the importance of First Peoples and their knowledge, which is quite ironic when we think about the types of animals and the types of plants that we want to protect, where they're found, the countries they're found, and who actually has the knowledge of those plants and those animals. So who better to inform research and systems about protecting those things than the people who have lived on or lived in those landscapes for millennia. So again, as I said, if you want to understand an Indigenous experience of conservation, then you need to understand the racism and the long-standing prejudices towards Indigenous communities embedded in our approaches to conservation. And seed conservation is not immune to this. Seed conservation has its roots in imperialism. Botanical gardens are not just pristine sites filled with exotic plants designed to create a serene environment. They are or were once the laboratories and distribution centres for colonial powers, because colonial botanists would deposit their collected, smuggled, stolen plant specimens from distant lands in those gardens for study. And they used gardens to hybridise, cultivate and harvest lucrative plants from across their empires and use them to make profit from their loot. These gardens are arguably the birthplace of cash crops and the plantation industry. Specimens and collections are also very much products of imperialism and slavery. Natural historians often sent detailed instructions to their colleagues in the colonies about what they wanted. Those colleagues relied on local knowledge and local people, often enslaved Africans or indigenous people, to find and collect those specimens. In June 2020, not long after the George Floyd murder and in the middle of our COVID lockdowns, the Royal Botanic Garden, Kew, acknowledged their part in the legacy of colonialism and racism, noting that for more than 260 years, scientists from Kew had explored every corner of the world, documenting the rich diversity of plants and fungi, seeing themselves as beacons of discovery and science, but by default, also beacons of privilege and exploitation, that they took, often without permission, plants from the colonies to store, grow, propagate and sell. And to this day, they still hold, house and protect plant species that are extinct or threatened in the wild, yet sacred to people across the globe. It is this complex past of conservation and seed collecting that come together to inform our work on seed sovereignty. For us as Māori in New Zealand, the current conservation laws and the seed conservation regulations created by government fail to cater for or give effect to our rights as articulated in Te Tiriti and our needs. TTW seed work is represented, so I'll go back, by three po, he tiriti, he tangata and he wharetaonga. He tiriti encompasses our work in the treaty tikanga protocol space. It aims to address resourcing and decision-making issues for our seed conservation aspirations. In this space, we expect to see new ways to practice conservation, particularly seed conservation, developed and supported methods as well for decolonising conservation. We will be releasing in the very near future a statement on seed conservation which lays down our bottom line beliefs and expectations of Ātiawa New Zealand seed conservation sector. It will include statements on all of these areas and some more. So it will note our cultural obligations as kaitiaki, our rights under Te Tiriti, our rebuttal of the Crown's ownership, and step into spaces and places and conversations around co-design, co-management, and other things as we develop it. The second po, he tangata, is our commitment to train our people to protect their seeds and their biodiversity. We know we need more people trained across the whole seed pipeline. It is our hope that we can encourage our people into seed conservation, but that we can also support them to the system to resource more roles for them and for others. This po is also committed to supporting the rediscovery and sharing of our traditional seed conservation practices, and it's intimately connected to food sovereignty. We have plans to run a 2-day seed course in Northland, thanks to Waitangi Wood for hosting us before the end of the year, and we hope to roll out more in the new year. So please keep an eye on our website and our social media. These are different, to the style that we ran a couple of years ago. So again, keep an eye on our social media and on our newsletters. Finally, po he wharetaonga is about infrastructure. It's the infrastructure we need to really be kaitiaki. This po is committed to providing the right equipment to our people and communities. And that means everything from seed drums for whānau or rongoaropu to seed labs in a box for the marae or the Ahu Whenua Trust, through to our commitment to build a Māori-owned seed bank and research centre. This seed bank is our attempt to ensure Māori are able to determine where their taonga are held, under what conditions, and with what practices and ceremonies around them. So the development of a Māori-owned seed bank and research centre is of utmost importance to our team because it's about sovereignty, he mana motuhake for our people and our relations to plants and the seeds. So kind of to wrap that up, the area that we're working in as Te Tira Whakamātaki are the three po of he tangata, he wharetaonga, he tiriti, or he tiriti, he tangata, he wharetaonga, if you want to put them in some kind of order. And for me, and the area of work that I'm passionate about, he tiriti, really we're focused on that mana motuhake, that sovereignty part, that acknowledgement that we have rights under Te Tiriti that aren't followed through in our policy and in our legislation and in our behaviours. The chain of custody isn't clear of the treaty right, the kaitiaki role that Māori play, and we're really working hard to develop those protocols and that statement around seed conservation that you will see before the end of the year. I think I might leave it there. I'm not sure if we have time, if we do questions or have time for that, but I'll leave it there. Hei kona, kia ora tātou.
Goodness, thank you very much, Mel. Yes, you were cracking along there. We actually have quite a lot of time left in your slot. But that's okay. You're out of slides, and so perhaps we'll chat about a couple of things that I've made notes on, and people will get questions and things they're interested in the question box. In fact, I can see ones come in already. I was interested to hear you speak about traditional seed conservation practices, and I wonder if you can expand on that at all and perhaps give us an example.
Yeah, so again, that's something I will drop my slides if I can figure out how to do that, or you'll do that, Renee.
Oh, it's okay. We usually just leave that final
cool.
slide up if that's okay with you.
I can put a picture up if it's prettier. There
That's
we go.
lovely. No, lots of good people, yes.
Yeah, so one of the conversations that we had in 2017 post Myrtle Rust was around traditional seed practicing or seed practices, and of course there's much debate around what those are and you know whether they've been used or not. I think a lot of what we know as our seed practices at the moment in Te Ao Māori are adopted, so they're a bit of a mixture between what might have been traditional approaches and what we've adopted post-settlement, because that's what we saw happening. So a really good example was we were talking to one of our seed collectors last week, and she was saying that she'd been running through one of the workshops, and people were giving her ideas around techniques like using honey and certain things that they were using to store and to help preservation. And in her mind, those weren't traditional Māori practices, but they were practices that Māori had adopted. So one, we're trying to ensure that we understand what those practices are that we've adopted and why we use them. So what we use to help preserve, where we preserve. Most of us preserve still in the garage like your nanny and granddad do, and like many of us do. But there are some other practices. If you think of our pātaka or our food storage processes, so our pits underground or our pātaka up high on the stilts, which were also about preserving crops for the whole season. And within that storytelling, there is knowledge around seed storage, especially for our kai like kumara, and some of that practice has it's not forgotten, it's just not being used. So trying to recall some of that at the moment and see how we can utilize that in our seed practice. Again, knowing that by and large, well, Māori didn't store for 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, but we certainly had periods where we were storing for multiple years. So yeah, just trying to dig into some of those practices. That's probably not a very good example of anything, but.
Well, yes, and I guess on that point, that raises something that you and I discussed briefly the other day, which is the notion of a seed bank as really potentially performing dual roles, potentially as acting like an ark, not locking things up, but preserving things for many, many years in the hope that future generations might have new technologies or new solutions in the face of some of these terrible plant diseases like myrtle rust. But seed banks can also act as very much a living repository whereby people are continuously drawing from them to continuously plant. So with the seed bank that you are planning and talking about at the moment, do you see it as playing one or both of those two roles?
Both of those roles, definitely. So it's a really good point that when we think of seed bank in our head, we often think of an ark for later. So we think of the Slavard vault that will be accessed by Ukraine after the war, or was accessed, by Syria after their war. And we think about it, as you say, as a doomsday vault for later. But actually, that's not reality, and that's not how we see it. For us, a seed bank is very much a living library. It is, yes, about understanding our seeds, the way they behave. So it's that laboratory research part of understanding how our taonga behave and how we can store them for the future. But it's also that living library and that living nursery that is about ensuring that we are constantly propagating, that we are looking for resistance, that we are, ensuring that when we roll out restoration programs, we are using the best plants. And that we're understanding how diseases are going to affect these plants every day. So it is, for us, it's both. Yeah, very much. There's a couple of things I'll probably just touch on, and it might help answer some of the other random questions that are probably not random questions that are coming through. The reason we're so fixated on a seed bank that's Māori owned for us, when there is already a seed bank in New Zealand, is because what we've seen in our experiences of visiting seed banks across the world. So we've been to a number of seed banks. We've been to community-owned seed banks in Hawaii, and we've been to the big, the Millennium Seed Bank, and we've looked at New Zealand ones. What they're missing from our view is an understanding of tikanga and the relationship between us as tangata whenua, or us as First Peoples, and the seed and the plant. And what we really want is a space that takes our culture, our tikanga, our language into consideration when it stores and looks after seeds. And a really good example was, we were told a story about an indigenous group from Thailand delivering seeds, and we know that our Peruvian whānau did the same, to Slavard. And they sent their seeds there because they wanted to protect them for the doomsday. They wanted them to be there in case something happened. And for them, they were delivering their children. They were delivering their taonga. And one of these groups in particular went in all their ceremonial regalia. They went with a very carved, ornate box to deliver their seeds. And they were received very warmly, and they were received respectfully. But what was said, and what was the real tipping point for them, and a realization for us in particular, was that when the seeds were received, there was disappointment in the lab about how many seeds were in the box. Like there might have only been 2 in one of them, and another one only had, like 4 or 5. And so they were kind of like, we went through all this from the seeds, but the bank perspective, we went through all this for like 2 seeds. How ridiculous. And from our perspective, it was like they were gifting you their children. They were giving you all they had to give. And so it just kind of cemented for us the different views that people have around seeds, and the importance for us about storing our seeds, not in a library like some of those pictures are, on shelves, but in a way that reflects how important they are to us and how we treat them as whānau. So for us, the fixation on infrastructure is really about ensuring that we bring back to life the tikanga around protecting seeds and the importance and sacredness of that. And again, that's why I started off by saying actually conservation is embedded in these views around white supremacy and colonisation. It's not to say that we're doing bad jobs, because none of us are. We're all doing it with the right intent. But those beliefs are embedded in our system, and if we don't unpack them via the po he te riti, if we don't unpack those, then we're always going to be operating in a space and in a system that has those underlying assumptions kind of built into it that people haven't checked and corrected.
Indeed, it's very, very timely, this work that you're doing and that TTW is doing. Now, we do have quite a lot of questions and comments coming through, so I hope you're okay to settle in for a bit of a chat, Mel. You can just give me a yell if you do need to rush off to your next engagement, but I think it would be great to work through some of these issues, and that we can in fact be grateful that you got through that slideshow with much speed, because I think sometimes these conversations can be really helpful for people and really important to learning how we can work better together in New Zealand. So the first one though is perhaps a little broad and echoes a little bit what we've already talked about, but if you don't want to make any further comment responding to what is the tikanga for seeds?
Yeah, I guess there's lots of tikanga for seeds depending on where you come from. From my view, seeds are, well, if we think of our creation myth, then we see he kākano feature throughout our stories. We know that seeds are very essential to our culture, our beliefs, our practices, the seed metaphor as well as the actual seed. And so for me, the tikanga around seeds is probably quite strong. Not only in terms of the karakia we should do before we look after them, the karakia we should do before we harvest them, but in the way we work with them in terms of the wairua that we bring to the table and the respect that we bring for the seeds. So the tikanga is there's lots of different tikanga around how you harvest them, how you store them, how you look after them, and then how you propagate them. And that tikanga evolves along the process and is linked to the seed and what it does and how we treat it, and what seeds should go together and what seeds shouldn't go together. So there's lots of tikanga around that, which is part of the stuff that we're unpacking in our 3PO.
Excellent. Yes, good to be reminded, or perhaps for you to highlight, that this applies at every stage of the process. Right, I better crack on. Yeah, there's a real mix of questions here, but I'm sure a few people are wondering, is there anything Pākehā can do to help, or is it best for us to just get out of the way?
No, don't get out of the way. No, don't get out of the way. Definitely there's things that Tau Iwi can do to help. I mean, in all of those posts, so we need Tau Iwi to help us in the capability space. We're not experts. We know that New Zealand in general has a bit of a pipeline issue in the seed conservation space. So if you've got spaces and places to train our people when you're doing seed work, please reach out and let us know. You know, our master's student in Te Tira Whakamātaki who's working on seed conservation has 2 Tau Iwi supervisors. So there's definitely spaces in there. In terms of infrastructure, we really want to do this in collaboration with all New Zealanders. We just want it to be kind of Māori centred when we do it. We operate on that philosophy that what's good for Māori is good for everyone. What's good for everyone's not necessarily good for Māori. So we believe if we do it from a Māori view, that it'll actually be really good for everyone. So please, if you're interested in infrastructure conversations and you want to help us there, then reach out. And of course, you know, the He Tiriti is really about us being really clear. I mean, for some of the He Tiriti stuff is Māori only. It's our conversations about what it means to be tangata whenua and what our role is in the seed conservation space. But there's definitely going to be a space where we need to come to our Crown partners and come to our agencies like DOC and MPI and talk to them about the policy and the legislative regulations around seed conservation, how they relate to us, especially as we step into conservation law reform, because we see heaps of opportunities in the conservation law reform to make some adjustments to ensure that seed conservation is much more easy for us as Māori, but also for all of New Zealand. So a really easy example is in fishing. We know we have customary harvest rights for fishing. We would expect something similar in the conservation law reforms for gathering of seeds or materials for weaving and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's definitely place for everyone in here. Don't feel like you need to get out of the way.
And so, yeah, the next question really very similar. Ngā mihi nui, the nui Melanie. I've been passionate about conservation for years. I wasn't aware of the colonialism injected into it. I mean, that's certainly only something I learned about when I was at university a few years ago. And yeah, how do we get involved? So I guess it really depends on what skills and interests you have, whether one might lobby a politician, get involved with a local conservation group. Are you interested in having people reach out directly to TTW?
Definitely, yeah. Reach out keep an eye on our social media, join our newsletter. There's always spaces and places there where we ask people to help. But yeah, of course, as you said, Renee, people can do all sorts of things to get involved.
And perhaps I'll look to include a little bit of information about TTW in the follow-up email to this webinar. Right. Getting into some maybe more technical things here. Do you have a stance on eco-sourcing versus assisted migration? Even though I'm not too familiar with that phrase, assisted migration, is that something you're familiar with, Mel?
I can take a stab on what I interpret that to mean. Look, we have a large chunk of our seed community that are like hell-bent on eco-sourcing as the only truth. But I think with climate change, there is an argument for assisted migration. And I think that this is part of the reason we stepped into seed conservation, actually, because when Myrtle Rust hit, one of the very first kōrero I heard coming out of non-Māori was, look, we're probably going to lose our rata, our Bartlett's rata, so let's just take it and go put it down south and help it grow down there, and then we'll have like a nice wee sanctuary for it down there. And we know that that's happened with Kodi, and we know that it's happened with other plants, especially our threatened plants. So I think that there's a role, and I'll come back to that, I think there's a role for that conversation very much about where is it going to be best for our plants to be growing given climate change. And where can we protect them from things like pests and diseases so that we always have some of those species, some of those taonga around. The reason we stepped into that conversation early on in the Myrtle Rust rollout was that conversation is actually a tikanga one for me. If we take a taonga from Ngāti Rihia or a taonga from Ngāti Porou and we go chuck it in Ngaitahu's territory, then Ngaitahu automatically have a responsibility to protect that baby for Ngāti Porou or Ngāti Rihia, but they might not be aware that they've got that role because we've done it without telling them. So the tikanga is really, really important for us, ensuring that mana whenua are aware of what's happening and that they have a say in it. They might not have the capacity or the interest in being the whāngai parents or the foster parents for those taonga without, some planning, some thought, some consideration. So I actually am a fan of both. I think eco-sourcing and assisted migration are both vital, but I think we have to have the tikanga conversation around it just to make sure that it's done in the right way.
And do you see TTW as providing the structure for that communication to happen?
Yeah, we certainly want to provide templates and advice and support for it where we can. That's why we're focusing on the po he as well. It's why that's my focus at the moment. But it's not our role to have that conversation for mana whenua. We've always had this view that we sit at the table. For years and years, Māori consultants or organisations like ours would sit at the table as a mediator between non-Māori and Māori, so between mana whenua and the Crown often. We don't see that as our role. We're not a mediator or a contractor that sits between. We sit firmly on the side of mana whenua, but we are certainly their advocates and their supporters or their technicians to help them have the right conversation.
Excellent. And given we've just been chatting a little bit about climate, I would expect this is something that will come a bit later on, but are you mapping climate-driven ecosystem loss and how this may add pressure to already struggling species?
No, we're not, but I'd like to have a conversation with someone about that.
Yes, exactly. All right. A little bit of a different direction now, but I would like to be inclusive and try and get through all of these questions if we can. If it does get a bit nuts, Mel, we're able, of course, to see all these questions after the event, you and I, and we can always answer people in writing. So do keep getting them in, people, if they come up, and we'll try and get answers for you. All right, what advice would you give to a Māori student entering the conservation research space in ecology with regard to upholding mātauranga Māori within a Western science-dominated university?
Well, first of all, I would say kia kaha te whanaunga, stay strong, be brave. My first piece of advice is pick your battles. You can't fight everything. You're a student. First and foremost, you need to study. You need to get your degree and sort yourself out. So don't fight every battle. It's not your job to do that. So create a network of support around you where you can express frustration. You can talk about opportunities. You can offload some of the mamai or the hurt that might come to you while you're studying and while you're being, no doubt, hit up for help and support and joining a gazillion postgrad programs, which will happen. So first and foremost, look after yourself, create a network around you, pick your battles. I think when it comes to upholding mātauranga Māori within I think in general it's getting easier. I have seen much more acceptance of mātauranga Māori running in parallel with Western science and not one above the other. That's not to say that you won't come across in your studies different views. You'll come across people who have a very different view that science is the one true system, that it's the font of all knowledge, that it's unbiased, and that it will provide all your answers. And when you're in that space, again, you need to pick your battles, but you also need to be really clear in your mind about what mātauranga Māori is. And I'm happy to have this conversation if you hit me up on Facebook or on my email, what mātauranga is, what it isn't, where it feeds in, and where it needs to be protected. So I think in our eagerness to ensure that mātauranga is embedded in everything and upheld, we have, as Māori, also thrown too much out there. So there are some areas where we need to protect mātauranga, and it shouldn't be part of Western science conversations. But there are definitely opportunities where the two align and where the two meet. And that's where you want to be playing as a student in that space, and then protect the other stuff. But hit us up on TTW and we'll certainly build you into our youth network, which has just stood up as well.
That sounds like a fantastic initiative. And very good advice there. All right, coming back to immediate practical matters in terms of a seed bank, given the huge variety of plants here, how do you determine what goes into the seed bank?
And what doesn't? Good questions. What goes into a seed bank and what doesn't? Look, I thought that I had this sorted when we did our concept plan and when we were working with the architects and figuring out what sizes and dimensions we would need. And then I was, and we have a seed conservation ropu, advisory ropu or kāhui, and I got sideswiped by them who were like, oh, you're going to add in this and you're going to add in this. So I can't answer that because I don't know what should go into it, obviously. I thought it should only be species that we identified as taonga, that were identified as taonga by mana whenua. And originally our seed bank was being designed based on waka, so we were going to have banks or that were dedicated to certain waka, and we would save according to what was important to those waka, so the mātauranga waka or the takitimu waka. And then that got blown out of the water at our last meeting, and I was told that no, food sovereignty is really important. COVID has shown us that everything's a mess and we're going to be saving more than that. So yeah, I think that's a really big question that I don't think I'll ever be able to answer, what goes in and what doesn't.
There's a lot to work through. How can we avoid further or repeat colonisation while pursuing and ensuring sovereignty over things that are part of nature, such as seeds? And I guess the statement that you're working on and the documentation you're working on will help with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that'll help set up kind of what our baseline is. As we said, it's our line in the sand of what we expect in the seed system. So it's kind of, this is the system, this is what the system should believe in, core values, core principles. And, we're not going to debate any of this stuff. So, we, as I said in the slide, we absolutely refute the idea that the Crown owns plants or that they own seeds. And so that'll be a bottom line for us. I think that in part is how we don't repeat colonisation in the conservation spaces. We start to have conversations about what it means to own nature or not own nature, and who has the rights to make decisions about nature spaces. And I think New Zealanders, by and large, are going to have that conversation when it comes to conservation law reform, because we're going to have to decide whether we think the Crown should be managing 33% of our land, and whether we think they've done that well or not in the past. So we need to have open dialogue across all of New Zealand. We need to acknowledge the role that tangata whenua have in that conversation as well, to ensure that we don't repeat, the colonial kind of views in conservation. Yeah, when it comes to sovereignty over things such as seeds, we have a belief that Māori have a cultural authority over seeds. That means that we have a kaitiaki role to ensure that they're protected and that they are looked after in a way that aligns with our tikanga. But we would, I wouldn't suggest that we own them. So sovereignty is not about ownership for us.
That's true, and it's easy to get caught up in questions around ownership, but whether one considers something is owned or not, if somebody's going to do something with something, then we have to discuss who makes the decisions around what should be done and how.
Yeah.
Whether it's owned or not, right? Something's happening with that taonga. All right. Now, it's lovely to have offshore guests in our webinar series, so I will read out the statement from Hawaii, hopefully not make too much of a mess of this. Mahalo nui loa from Hawaii. Look forward to sharing the lessons learned from your upcoming statements in our islands here. So people from afar are watching us, Mel.
All right. That's Jason. So ngā kia koe, Jason.
It is a different individual, but we can chat about that a bit later. You see your fan base is growing, Mel. All right. And another practical question that is probably something that the seed bank as a whole would tackle a bit later, but how do species that can't be stored long-term as seeds factor into ideas around seed bank infrastructure? Well, one just comes up with another way to do it. It doesn't one, I would think.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point and why we need more investment in seed conservation in New Zealand, isn't it? Marcus Rongofitiao, our research policy analysis, and TTW did a podcast on RNZ about 2 days ago, so have a look for that, where he talked about, a wee bit more of the technical stuff, because he's the technical person, not me, I'm the policy person. So he talked about the technical issues around storing some of those seeds, like Cody in particular. So yeah, we need more investment in infrastructure and in research in New Zealand in seed conservation katoa, whether that's Māori or non-Māori, I don't care. We just need to know how our seeds are best stored. We know that we don't know enough about our seeds, and Beyond Myrtle Rust is a really good example of how we've had to invest really quickly and heavily in a particular area to get an understanding to protect from a disease. And so the more preemptive we can be in this space, the better. But we need investment, and we need investment across all of the agencies and all of the groups doing it. I'm not saying it's just for us in the Māori space. We need to know, we need the technical information, and then we need to know, as you said, Renee, what's the best option. Sometimes it's going to be constant living libraries, isn't it, nurseries. Other times it might be looking at what, the cryo space is going to give us. So we just need more information, more research.
And fast. Now, question here, excellent kōrero, Melanie, would you support the same approach to developing animal seeds, examples, eggs, sperm, embryos, tissue banks?
Yeah, so I currently sit on the board of a group called Tāpui Ātiawa, which is a not-for-profit subsidiary of Next Foundation, and Tāpui Ātiawa are looking at exactly that. So they're looking at how we seed bank animal seeds at the moment and what's needed for that. And central to that rōpū, as you can imagine, with people like myself and Aroha Mead and Andrew Byram and others sitting there, is the conversation around the treaty role in that and the tikanga role. So they also have a tiriti working group that is probably going to release a statement for them as well. So yeah, so it's been worked on and linked up.
Excellent. And what about the practice of propagating seeds of endangered plant species overseas and having things in botanic gardens overseas? I mean, that's something that already takes place or has taken place. Is that something that you think we could continue to actively pursue, or you'd rather just focus on how we can make things right that have already been done, and think more about what's going on in New Zealand?
Again, a good question. I mean, my first introduction into the seed space was via Kew Gardens, and you know, Aroha Mead did her masters many years ago. Not that she's that old, but many years ago in the Kew space, looking at that question around repatriation of our plants, of our taonga plants back to Ātiawa, New Zealand. And I know in TTW we have conversations with botanical gardens across the globe, either looking for new, more resistant species, and or having conversations about how they open their gardens for Māori in those areas. A really good example is the Melbourne Botanical Gardens, which have a really large collection of harakeke and have now opened it up to local Māori to harvest from for rāranga. So there are lots of conversations and lots of roles that botanical gardens across the globe play in protecting our taonga species. So I don't think that, so this is my view, and it's not necessarily all of Māori view. I think that there's definitely a role for botanical gardens across the globe to help us understand how our plants grow, survive in different climates, especially as climate changes, and how they handle diseases that we don't have in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and hopefully won't get. So it does mean we have to work with those botanical gardens quite closely to ensure that we know what they've got, where it came from, and how it's handling their environments. And so we do definitely trying to do that, but again, there are some ways that botanical gardens can do that that's respectful to the taonga that they have, and also there's a bit of work we need to do to collect those taonga back to the mana whenua that they came from. So a lot of botanical gardens don't know where their plants come from, or they have a vague idea, and for us it's really important that mana whenua know what of their where their taonga are, so that they can have a relationship with it if they choose to.
Excellent, something you've obviously put lots of thought into and lots of good ideas there. This is a bit more of a comment, somebody asking yourself and I guess the audience, have we heard about Terraformation, an international organisation that supports Indigenous peoples in seed collection and storage with things like equipment, software, expertise and funding?
Yep, I assumed that was Jason doing the other comment, so, but no, yes, we've heard of Terraformation. And
something that people might like to put up. Right, and yes, more of a comment, tissue culture could be considered for seeds that don't store well, so you have a living culture of kauri, for example. The tikanga on this is unclear though, no doubt.
Yeah.
All right, and so excited about your seed bank becoming reality, so awesome to hear. And just one that I think we can finish on, the name of the animal seed bank, not for profit you are on, keen to get involved with that kaupapa.
Oh, kia ora, Tāpui Aotearoa. And if Libby's online, then Libby is the gem behind that, Libby Cagle. So yeah, Tāpui Aotearoa. Maybe you can find them through Next Foundation.
I think there are a few things that we can include in the follow-up email to this webinar. All right, well, that has been a fantastic presentation and kōrero. Thank you so much. We've still got most of the audience here, which is fantastic, but I think we do need to wrap it up now. And a video of today's webinar will be made available on the Beyond Myrtle Rust website in the next couple of days. It will also be emailed to everyone who registered. The next webinar will be on Wednesday, December 14th, and we will hear from Alyssa Martino, a PhD student at the University of Sydney. She is researching genetic resistance to myrtle rust, and the title of her talk is Melaleuca quinquenervia, towards a model for myrtle rust research. So turning back perhaps to more traditional subjects that we've tackled in the webinar series so far. That's it for today, everybody. Haere rā, and see you next time.